I'm Kelly Connolly. I'm going to kick off a presentation here. I'm going to introduce my esteemed colleague, Joe Iacobucci. We're going to have a good panel here focused around autonomous connected vehicles and sort of what it means to land economics. So we have Joe Iacobucci here. He's the new mobility practice leader and director of transit at Sam Schwartz. He's an internationally recognized leader in new mobility and guiding clients to manage the emergence of autonomous vehicles. Joe's responsible for managing several major projects, including regional new mobility studies for Seattle, Miami, Denver, New York, Los Angeles, and other major markets. He's also performed national studies for Transit Center and the National Academies, in addition to guidance for the US DOT, APTA, you'll have to ask him what that means, National Center for Mobility Management. In addition, he's guided the private sector in achieving mobility solutions in the public realm, including work with Ford Smart Mobility, representatives here, Chariot, and Motivate. Key to his approach on new mobility and autonomous vehicles is his intuitive grasp on mass transit, mobility, access, market optimization, and transportation technologies. He's the co-author of the Driverless Future Report, and his work has been featured in Wired, Fast Company, TechCrunch, Slate, the Atlantic City Lab, Curbed, as well as several conferences and academic publications. So Joe's going to start us off with a presentation, and then we'll invite our panelists up.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks everybody for showing up today. For those of you who are truly disappointed that Sam isn't here, just go to one of these back corner tables and close your eyes, and it'll be all the same. No, this is a terrific room because we do have the monitors here. So, and thanks for the terrific introduction, Kelly. And we do have a terrific panel here. Before we get into the panel, we're going to have three different perspectives. My perspective of I'll be moderating, we'll be discussing sort of how cities are dealing with this. And then Ellen Partridge, who's with us from the Shared Use Mobility Center, will be talking about the legal perspective from this. And then Elizabeth Irvin, who's with us from CMAP, will be talking about the regional perspective. And so we'll look at this through three different lenses. To start us off, though, we prepared a presentation just to provide some guidance. A lot of these are some of the thoughts that help guide our work with cities. And we call this specifically outlining the revolution because this photo is not ours, and I apologize if it's somebody else's in the room, but as part of my job is attending conferences, and I can't tell you, every time you go to a conference, people talk about the future, they put a bunch of neon lights, a Wi-Fi signal, and they call it a day. And that being said is that nobody can specifically tell you what's going to happen in the future, but what we help to try to advise clients on is to identify how we could use things from today to think about how things will be in the future. And so before we go to the future, I'd like to go to the past here. And just to kind of identify where we've been for the past generation, and really, as Sam Schwartz, what we help advise clients to do, up until the post-war era, largely our cities were designed for multi-modes and pedestrians. And then we gave these guys one job to do, and that was to build things like this to move cars. And because of that, vehicle miles traveled went through the roof, and that was basically a 20-year solution until we got to congestion. In the early 70s, a lot of our center cities were already at congested limits, and I'm not anti-car, but we've run out of this as a solution. And that's just not me, but it's also Vic's boss, Bill Ford, who's recognizing this and looking at the way that a consumer automotive company has to shift into a mobility company. But when you look at sort of the imprint, bringing it back to land economics that's left in our cities, this is where I grew up. This is Cleveland, Ohio, and I know that Land Alpha was recently there. Huge parts of our center cities, and this is not just Cleveland, not picking on Cleveland, but have been devoted to the storage of cars. And when you look at structured parking, it's a valuable use of real estate that necessarily is not the highest and best use for that. And when you look at other trends too, we literally ran out of colors to identify what the obesity trends in the U.S. But we also have seen things like the states that drive less have better economies, This is a nice graphic from Vancouver, which has identified that it can lower the amount of vehicles entering the center city and growing the economy and population at the same time. So there's a lot of momentum. Millennials are driving less, and when we look at things like opportunity cost, this is from the city of Portland, that they identified they could build an entire bicycle network, high-capacity bicycle network for the price of 1 mile of a 4-lane urban freeway. So we're starting to recognize these things. And so that brings us back. We're not going to go to the future yet, but we're going to sort of go back to where we've been in the last 10 years, which has been nothing short of a revolution already in mobility. And everything that you see here in purple didn't exist in the year 2000. So just if you want to take a sense of where we've been, so even beyond Uber and Lyft, but looking at bike share, which is a fundamental part of mobility with every city, and you look at other car share, and recently the city of Chicago launched Car2Go. These are different innovations, and so but when you look at these different mobility innovations that are led mostly by the private sector, you can see that they have their roots in public transit. So the bike share system is simply a peer-to-peer transit network. Uber and Lyft sort of evolved out of the taxi industry. And when you boil it down to, there's a couple key concepts I just want to sort of familiarize everybody with. And one is mobility as a service, which is a concept it's in Scandinavia, which basically identifies the commodification of trips, that form is no longer as important as functionality dominates the conversation. And so in other words, you don't have to buy the cow, you can simply buy the milk. Right? Geofencing. Does anybody in the room know what geofencing is? I've got a couple hands here. Well, so geofencing, it literally is using technology to have certain things occur in technology. If anybody pulls up their phone today, phone right now, Twitter and Facebook will be marketing to you directly, and they'll probably have an ad for Wildfire. Companies do this already. If you go to an airport, you'll see this most prominent right now, using geofencing to allow for Uber and Lyft pickups at certain locations, so you can allow things at certain locations, or you can not allow things at certain locations. And when you look at the quick change of transportation mobility, and you look at it through 3 different lenses, the public policy perspective, the collective, the private industry, and the consumer perspective, in the 20th century is a little bit more cut and dry. We basically identified that we wanted people to drive a lot of vehicles for most of their trips, so we built a lot of highways. Private sector reacted to that and identified we built a lot of vehicles, and consumers drove for about 80-90% of all their trips. Just in this quick time, that it's a private sector that's really leading the charge here. We're only here talking about this today because consumers are adapting to this in wide numbers. And a lot of the work that we do is to try to identify what does the public policy mean in this perspective. It's only going to be amplified when we have autonomous vehicles. So now we will go to the future. So it's not a matter of if they're coming or if autonomous vehicles or connected vehicles or electric vehicles are coming. There's already pilots here that are already on the street. There's already guidance that's happening. And we did a study with Arcadis and HRNA where we identified, just looking at from the perspective of cost, compared to who is driving their own vehicle today, what's the potential for mode shift if taking an autonomous vehicle in a pool-like service or an Uber-like service in the future is cheaper? Right? So we just wanted to kick the tires on that. And through this analysis, what we identified is that currently today, there's about 5.2 million people that are commuting, driving their own vehicle. In the future, about 40 to 60% of those people will be better off economically taking a pool-like service run as an autonomous vehicle. So there's a tremendous amount of mode shift that we could see that we haven't seen for almost over a century now. In Los Angeles, where it's a little more polycentric, that shift is still 30 to 40%. And even in Dallas, which is largely suburban, free parking everywhere, it's about 20 to 30% of the people that live there today would be better off economically taking one of these services, an autonomous vehicle. And so what does that lead us? When we outline this is partially from Sam's book here. We identified 3 potential scenarios, and a lot of the work to date has been sort of scenario testing. And so I'll go through a couple of these potential impacts one by one here. So what's the good? Well, if it's done correctly, it speaks to this add by lift, which is that the transit system, this is the New York City subway system, serves as the backbone, and you use new mobility or shared mobility or autonomous vehicles for last mile connection if managed correctly, right? That people share their trips. There is a study that was done in Stockholm where they basically modeled all the trip pairs in the city of Stockholm, and they identified that all the trip pairs could be served for if people were sharing their vehicles for about less than 10% of the overall vehicles in the city. So 10% of the vehicles to move all the people on trips if we could share, and we have the peer-to-peer nature to share. And what does that do for parking? When you compare the space that's utilized for the storage of cars, if people no longer need to store their vehicles next to their destination, for instance, if you're to come to lunch here today, your vehicle could drop you off, or you're taking an Uber or Lyft type of service, it drops you off. You no longer need parking next to destinations. It can be pooled parking. And we looked at this for the city of Seattle in the Ballard neighborhood. And Ballard is a very high-intensity mixed-use neighborhood, not too different from River North. And we identified that we could basically park the whole neighborhood for about 60 vehicle spaces on street and off street. So there's a tremendous amount of value that could be saved with that. And what could you do with that space? Well, you could put it back and identify that we give it back to vehicles, or we can do things like this is a concept that we developed with FXFOL that shows, using the parklet, that we can actually reprioritize that space for multimodal uses, similar to what the Loop Link has done in the Loop here, but also things like people spaces and parklets, things that CDOT is already leading the way on. So that's if it's great. If it's not, what we've seen sort of in early phases is that as ride services have grown, some transit services have declined. If we don't manage this in the future, this is from Copenhagenize, which is a great graphic. Simply put, we're not going to be building major new urban roadways, and so we have this potential to repeat that. If managed correctly, though, we can look at things like mobility hubs. This is from our client in Seattle, and so it's really about managing this. And I'll just kind of leave this off. If you look at sort of where we came from and where we're going, a lot of the big benefits of autonomous vehicles is that they're going to be much safer than us as humans. Are not very good drivers overall, but there's a lot of room for improvement there. And that may be true, but there's another stat that we want to point out. The fact is that 8 out of 10 non-communicable diseases are due to inactivity. And so if we build a culture that sustains that, we could potentially do a lot more harm to ourselves than good from autonomous vehicles. So the 4 things I would say that we'll definitely see in our lifetime, so as we finish the outline, is increased competition. We'll have new services that are offered. There'll be greater competition. Cities are going to undergo a funding disruption, whether or not that's at the parking meter, at the transit agency. There's going to be disruptions that we're going to have to deal with. You talk about a gas tax that could completely go away with electrified vehicles. The phasing out of parking spaces, it's already starting to escalate right now, and a potential new equity issue, getting to one of the themes of Lambda Alpha, that with any technology breakthrough, you have the digital divide, or you have accessibility issues that we have to be laying out there. So I'm going to stop this presentation here because I do want to get to our guests and provide a couple of different perspectives, but we'll definitely take some questions at the end of this. So if we could switch the presentation up there, I'm going to introduce our first guest. So we're lucky to be joined by Ellen Partridge, who's a transportation law and policy specialist who served in senior positions at the US DOT under the Obama administration. Prior to joining the US DOT, Ellen worked as a transportation policy analyst for the State Smart Transportation Initiative at the University of Wisconsin. She previously served as Deputy General Counsel on Policy Appeals for the Chicago Transit Authority, where we were old colleagues, and focused on a lot of policy initiatives. She holds an MBA from the University of Chicago. She's a fellow at Leadership of Greater Chicago and a senior fellow at the Environmental Policy Center until recently. And just last month, she joined the Shared Use Mobility Center as the Director of Policy and Strategy. So if I could have a quick round of applause for Ellen Partridge.
Thank you, Joe. Joe and I actually worked together at the Chicago Transit Authority some distant past. So with automated vehicles, there have really been sort of three kinds of waves. The first one was technological, the kind of excitement about, can we really do this thing? And it's obviously continuing. The second wave was really thinking about safety. So is this actually safe? Do we want these things out on the roads? How do they get tested? Who's going to decide? And that too is continuing, especially with the recent accidents. The woman who was killed in Arizona while she was walking her bicycle across the road has caused a great deal of attention and some changes in how legislators have been looking at what kind of laws they might need. And the third wave is really looking at the kinds of secondary impacts that there might be. So what's the impact on pollution? What's the impact on land use? A whole series of issues. Let's see. Are we up? No. There we go. So when we think about legislation, thinking about, what are the automated vehicle problems that we might actually need a law for? So safety, certainly under consideration, congestion, land use. If we have much more, if it's so easy to take a vehicle anywhere and have it circle around and wait for you while you go to the drugstore or the laundry, then we could have a lot more vehicle miles traveled. And with that could come pollution. Certainly there might be access and mobility issues. As Joe mentioned, there are potential equity issues if these are only available to people who have a lot of money. Standardization. How will these vehicles use the roads? Do we need to think about redesigning our roads for them, or redesigning the vehicles themselves? So I'm always thrilled by this picture of a road in ancient Pompeii that was uncovered by lava, because the wheel tracks are very clearly seen, and those stepping stones are for the pedestrians. And so the question is, was this designed by the wagon makers? Was it designed by the city officials? How did it come about? How was it iterated through various things that actually made it work? Other legal issues certainly are liability and insurance, and that's gotten a lot of attention in the legal community as a potential stopper for automated vehicles. My personal view is that the legal system for liability and insurance is different in every one of the 50 states now. We've managed to muddle through with that kind of system, and I think that the legal systems are just robust enough to take care of this new kind of technology. Privacy, I think, is a much harder issue. Privacy, cybersecurity, and I think we need a lot more technological work done on that. I'm going to give you the fastest run through. There are many lawyers in the room, so forgive me if I leave too many of the nuances untouched. But basically, on automated vehicles, we have on the federal side, the federal government regulates the safety of the vehicles themselves. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, also known as NHTSA, has a number of standards, many of which say you have to have a person behind the wheel. On the federal side, Congress, I think, has been acting as if NHTSA was not acting fast enough to regulate automated vehicles, and so Congress is considering legislation passed by the House, a different version of the legislation passed by under consideration by the Senate, which basically would allow more vehicles out on the road after having provided some safety information to NHTSA and to the public. But again, that legislation has not been passed. At the Department of Transportation, they have had 2 series of guidances. But again, guidances, I looked at in this guidance to see how actual, what kind of teeth it had. And I think the word must appears about 10 times. The word should about 80 times. And must, in the context of safety, must be our first priority. So it's not something that says, we really, the Department of Transportation are really saying what you must do. A third version of that guidance is supposed to come out this month and will also be expanded to cover buses and trucks. The first 2 did not. And similarly, on the federal side, the proposed legislation now does not include trucks and buses. And the concerns of the trucking industry and the workers there are very strong, and they've had good success in getting their voices heard. On the state side, states typically work on licensing commercial driver's licenses. They work on revenue development, so the fuel taxes on the state side, liability and insurance, again, are state functions, and law enforcement is done on the state side. A couple of interesting proposals have been made on the state side. One of the interesting things about a big change is that there are kind of opportunistic things that get tacked on to laws. So state law proposals again, all automated vehicles must be electric or renewable. That's Massachusetts. A VMT tax would be imposed. Several states, again, in proposed legislation. A lower
VMT means
vehicle miles traveled. Thank you. A lower tax in off-peak hours or where there are multiple passengers in a vehicle. A higher tax on zombie vehicles, those vehicles with no one in them. Another kind of law that was proposed was one about mischief making that would classify thwarting an automated vehicle as reckless driving. So what I can well imagine, teenagers just trying to make the thing go around in circles. Well, that could be classified as reckless driving, which is a fairly serious kind of activity. On the local side, much more localized activity, parking, the kinds of things that localities know best about, like where is there a need for lower speed limits and stuff like that, is typically on the local level. But local laws have more variation than is possibly imaginable. In New York City, for example, cannot pass a congestion fee. That has to be done in Albany, but in Buffalo, they can end, as they did, all parking requirements in certain parts of the city. So there's just a real hodgepodge of authority that is given to localities. Let me turn now to my current organization, the Shared Use Mobility Center. Which is really, this is the goal, a transportation system that works for everyone. It's very much like what Sam Schwartz has as the ideal too. But the point I want to make is that really the transit system has to be the center of this system because it just sort of doesn't work in geometry otherwise. If we tried to have automated vehicles that took one person and let them off at an office building, and you wanted all the people in that office building to be there between the hours of 8 and 9 in the morning, you would only be able to build an office building that was 6 or 7 stories high because the geometry just wouldn't take it. You have to have public transit which collects people and then they walk to part of the way. So there's lots of reasons why we want walking. There's lots of reasons we want streets that are set for everyone, but this is our goal. So.
Terrific intro, Ellen. Thank you. Now for our next speaker, and Ellen's going to stay up here. So Elizabeth Irvin is a senior planner at CMAP, or the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and she is in the Policy and Programming Division and works primarily on transportation issues, including emerging technologies, system resilience, and changing travel behavior. Recently, much of her time has been developing onto 2050s. I'm sure if you're not familiar with that process right now, please do check it out, which is our region's next long-range plan, which does include a lot of the thoughts on emerging technologies and autonomous vehicles. So previous to that, though, Elizabeth has a Master in City Planning from MIT and a Bachelor's in Arts and English from Williams College. She also worked in Washington, D.C. and Massachusetts on federal and regional transportation and environmental policy. If I could have a round of applause for Elizabeth Irvin.
Grab this last microphone, and I only have one slide. I promise I'll be quick on that front so we can get to discussion and questions. Let's see if we can go the right way here. So this is my one and only slide, and this is a graphic that if folks haven't seen before, this is not unique to automated vehicles, but is a company called Gartner puts out this concept of how new technologies sort of come into the market and come into the public conversation. And basically this is true of lots of things, but it starts with, the technology's invented, and everyone gets really excited about it. And there's a bajillion articles in Wired about how it's going to solve every problem in the world. And then people get bored of reading those articles. People get bored of writing those articles. And things start to happen that make people kind of question, oh, this technology, maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be. Maybe there are some huge problems here. And that's the trough of disillusionment. And all those negative articles start coming out. And then eventually, these technologies, they develop, people work out some of the kinks, and they end up achieving some of their potential. Not all of it, but they play a role in making the world a better place. So how does this apply to automated vehicles? I think it's pretty clear. And so coming from CMAP, and if folks are familiar with CMAP, we're the long-range transportation planning and comprehensive planning agency for the Chicago region. And so we're thinking really about how do we make decisions and plan today for 50 years down the line. And we don't know exactly how these technologies are going to play out, but we can sort of guess where we are on this cycle. And thinking about sort of how do we decide today, things like what road projects should we invest in? What transit projects should we invest in? What kinds of land use patterns should communities be thinking about? So we've been having this in mind as we've been going through the development of Onto 2050, which if folks don't know about, we're wrapping it up right now. The comment period actually just closed yesterday. So if you haven't submitted your comments yet, it's a little too late. But I'm sure that a lot of you have been in conversations all along. We're going to be revising over the next month or so, and then we have our big launch event. Hopefully our board will adopt the plan in October, and we'd love to see you all just down the street at Millennium Park on October 10th. If you haven't gotten emails about that, we'd love to have you there. So as part of that process, we did a lot of scenario planning and looking at, as Joe was talking about, how do we really use this technology to meet our goals for the region and not have sort of technology drive the conversation, but what are our goals and how do we put technology to work for us? And what are the kinds of things we can do today that even if technology changes pretty dramatically and evolves in different forms, still makes sense. And a lot of these things are things that Ellen and Joe have already mentioned, making sure we're investing in our transit system, thinking about how do we build that communications and infrastructure and data infrastructure to help set us up to be able to use these technologies as they come online and understand what impact they're having. And then, as I'm thinking is probably something that's really on a lot of your minds, what are the land use implications and how do we think about, how do we set all these technologies up to succeed? So I know we'll get into more of that conversation later, but I'll leave off on my slides here and turn the mic back over to Joe.
Thank you. So this last part of the session, I think a lot of people have questions. So I'm going to just start off with a couple, and if you guys can be ready to have your questions. How are we doing this questions, by the way? Am I just going around with the mic, or
Yeah, we'll carry mics around the room for you.
Terrific.
Yeah, we got about 15 minutes till the program needs to end.
Yep.
So maybe 7 or 8 minutes of questions for the panel, and then we can go to the room.
Sure. Sounds great. So let's start off with a couple quick ones. Should we be building more train stations or transit right now with autonomous vehicles coming?
Well, that's a harder question than thinking about whether we should be building more roads. I think we do need to build more transit, but we need to think of it in a more flexible kind of way. So the goal that we're really looking for is a kind of multimodal transportation system. So you can use an app on your phone that will pay for your bike share, your transportation network company, your transit, to rent a car. It's really looking at how do we turn kind of ownership into usership. So thinking about transit is one part of it, and it probably is the part, we still need, big buses on big streets, and we still need rail. So yes.
And I think what we talk a lot about in our plan is about making sure we're making transit competitive. And we have a really great transportation infrastructure in the Chicago region. There's lots of things we can do to invest in our existing transit system to make it more frequent, more reliable, more efficient. And then a big piece of it, and we did a bunch of analysis, I won't get into all the sort of modeling details of it, that was looking at what are the things that have the biggest impact on transit ridership. And they're really, surprisingly to some of us, not necessarily building a whole bunch more transit. It's about how do you change the land use around existing transit, and particularly employment around transit stations is a big focus of our work going forward, is how do you make those transit stations that we have get the most use possible.
Could I just add though? It's really trying to understand how to make transit cheaper, faster, better, and so having dedicated lanes for transit is really important. So if we, with our existing transit system, if we have dedicated lanes and if we have transit signal priority where at red lights turn green faster for buses, those things would be really, really helpful in making transit work with the rest of the system.
And this is again stuff that makes sense regardless of whether autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles are on the road.
Terrific, and I'll just put in my 2 cents. I'll pretend I'm Sam for a second. What I'll say is, having worked previously for the CTA and understanding just the tough situation for funding for transit, we continue to fund our transit systems in the U.S. at half the amount as our first world counterparts. And in order for the system for mobility as a service to work with having all the congestion and access benefits, that we need to fund our transit system better. We need to be able to run the train at 45 miles an hour as it's designed to do, so it can be competitive with other modes. And so I'll close off there. So getting to sort of the theme of the Lambda Alpha series here, what's the potential for this for autonomous vehicles to impact economically disadvantaged or disconnected neighborhoods?
I think, just as you were sort of showing from Sam's slides, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, depending on how these technologies play out and sort of the way we shape them. Some of these technologies really have the potential to make a huge difference in people's lives. Folks who can't drive, who can't afford a vehicle, have another option to get around, assuming that these services are affordable and available in their neighborhoods. We did a bunch of analysis that was looking at where folks in some communities, low-income communities, trying to get to. A lot of these neighborhoods actually have a lot of transit, but the problem is that the transit doesn't necessarily take folks to where the jobs are. And the places where the jobs are, when you look in some of the south suburban communities or out in Will County, some intermodal facilities, those are hard to serve with your sort of general transit. So there might be really a place for some of these technologies to fill some gaps for trips. But it's important that we think about equity up front and not just sort of wait until we see the problems. The disability community is really advocating a lot around automated vehicle technology and making sure that these technologies are designed to be accessible to folks from the get-go and not having to reinvent it and sort of engineer solutions once the design's already in place.
I would just add the density question is really an important one for transit, because often we think, well, transit works really well in dense areas, but some areas have been de-densified because sort of for all kinds of reasons. And so you end up with a kind of downward spiral. So making sure that we think about, where can we put mobility hubs, where can we put new stations that actually will help in economic redevelopment.
I want to open it up to everybody else, and if you guys don't have a ton of questions, we'll go back to my questions, but I think I see Christine, who's always a terrific person to start us off, to start us off here.
I have a question about the autonomous vehicle and why it isn't being used in mass transit today, because it seems like the variables that are there could be controlled with tracks and things like that. So what's inhibiting that?
So I'll just repeat the question. So, that there's a lot of promise for autonomous vehicle technology in public transit, and why aren't we seeing more of that? Because we do actually see some of that, right? You just go to O'Hare, right? You could see that the people mover, and those people movers do exist in Miami or in Detroit, right? Where they do serve as a form of transit. TransLink, if you want to see the future, you just go to Vancouver, and you can see a whole system that's run by driverless vehicles, and I think there's some testing as well. But I'll let my other panelists address that too.
Well, we could go to Paris, where their train system is run automatically, but it's different for buses, which don't have those fixed guideways, and so thinking about buses and microtransit. There are big questions about how do you ensure or keep security when if you want to get on a microtransit bus with no driver at 11 o'clock at night, are you gonna feel safe? Does there need to be some kind of remote monitoring? Just how is that going to work? So lots of questions about the design of vehicles and just how they will be controlled remotely, and what kind of security issues we might have that also tie in with employment issues, because it may be that if bus drivers are not needed at some point in the future, that they can provide really good customer service.
You said a lot of the things I was going to say.
We're on the same page.
So I was just in a lot of rural areas, driving through a lot of rural areas. And so I could see, having all the cars in this area be autonomous. But then when you get into those rural areas, and what's the interface there, and how will that work? And also when you're driving on these windy roads.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Often when we're talking about these futures, we tend to want to portray them as one or the other. Either we're going to have these fleets of automated vehicles and everything's going to be shared, or everyone's going to have their own personal automated vehicle. But I think the reality is it's going to vary a lot depending on where you are and where you're trying to go. And so in some rural areas, we may just not see as fast of adoption of autonomous vehicles, or it may be more of that sort of you own your own vehicle. And I think there is a big challenge in the next, 30 years, 50 years, of how all those vehicles are going to interact on the road together. One of the things I think this is in the book, and we've talked about it before, is that there are different levels of autonomous vehicles, and a lot of the vehicles on the road today have some of the technologies that we think of when we think of fully autonomous vehicles, so they can sense if they're drifting out of the lane or see if there's a car in front of them. So I think a lot of cars will get those kinds of technologies, even if they're not completely fully autonomous. But the question remains of, do we end up eventually having, lanes that are just for automated vehicles? Because that's when you start to get the biggest benefits in terms of speed and fast travel, or do we come up with some other solutions?
One other thing that is a consideration for rural areas is whether freight use of vehicles for freight and for passengers can be combined. And there are some interesting experiments in Sweden, where post office delivery trucks are picking up rural passengers and taking them to where they want to go, and I'm not quite sure how they get back, but I think they've got that. They've got that imagined. But with the technology that Uber and Lyft use, really, for hooking up passengers and vehicles, there may be some new opportunities.
And I think the freight piece will be a big factor in some less dense areas and in rural areas. Long distance trucking, intermodal facilities, really these technologies are going to have a big impact on how goods move around.
And I'll just put a final point on that. You'll see two types of technologies for communications: vehicle to vehicle communication, where vehicles are communicating with each other. So if I'm stopped at this stop sign, my vehicle's communicating with your vehicle. I'm stopped, so you can go. And there's also vehicle to infrastructure technology, and which basically at an intersection that the equipment on the ground will actually direct traffic, just as a traffic cop would or a signal would, in a sophisticated way. You basically say, when all these vehicles enter this interchange, they're going to act collectively in a certain way so everybody gets through in a safe and quick manner. And I think what you'll probably see is, in more urban areas where demand is higher, is more that vehicle to infrastructure, and where congestion is worse. And you'll probably see more of a reliance on V2V or vehicle to vehicle communication systems when you get into rural areas. So you'll still have some smart technology, but basically associating the right type of solution to the context.
You just mentioned Uber and Lyft, and we can now see the impact that Uber and Lyft has had on the senior community with their desire to go ahead and use that as a mode of transportation, which now has changed from a land use perspective the need for parking in senior housing development. When I start to think about autonomous vehicles, now how should we start to talk about land use planning with parking requirements? Thank you.
Well, and you're already seeing some pilots of sort of shared fleets. I think there's one in Bronzeville that are targeting sort of senior living facilities. Some of those kinds of communities are really great places to have, one shared vehicle or a couple of shared vehicles that could serve that whole community and really cut down on the need for parking. So I think you're already seeing developers starting to think about those issues.
There is a website, I think it's called Strong Towns, that shows where parking requirements have been reduced or eliminated across the country, and it grows every year. So it's really evidence of this trend.
And I'll say where the parking demand go in the future. I think what you're going to see in the near term is basically future-proofing of plans, and so whether it's designing for more pickup and drop-off spaces or designated zones for high-intensity pickup and drop-off that will replace parking, so it could be a net neutral gain in the near term. But in the long term, and I'll give a quick shout-out to Steve Wilson, who's at Gensler. Gensler has a terrific model that they built for the parking garage of the future, which could literally be converted section by section from a parking garage to office or residential space. And so I think you'll see where there's large infrastructure investments in parking today, that there'll be a little bit more money spent up front for that forward compatibility in the future.
We've got time for one more question.
Okay, the last question. So I listened to a TED talk earlier in the year on autonomous vehicles, and one of the points they made was that there could be a time where the cost of using an autonomous vehicle would be cheaper than using your typical fixed transit like a bus or a rail, and obviously more convenient to go door to door than from one transportation mode to another, and that in turn could result in increased traffic congestion. So I'm just curious on what the panelists think on that.
Well, I think the question is sort of the cost to who. The cost to the user might be less, but the cost sort of generally to maintain the infrastructure, if you have a lot more cars on the road, a lot more maintenance costs, those costs go up. And so I think at CMAP we've really identified pricing policy as a key metric and a lever that we can use to try to shape this technology and push it toward the direction we want it to go. So things like managed lanes, things like congestion pricing, things like pricing parking, all can really help us avoid that future which I think everyone knows we don't want to see a future where we just have, that was one of your slides, which just shows the exact same interstate with the same amount of cars on it, but they're automated. So pricing policy is really something that we need to be moving forward on and try and come up with good models on.
I'm not an economist, but I can use the word externalities to say that the things that need to be priced are, the trouble, the damage that your car is causing to the environment, to congestion, and so thinking about how pricing can take into account whether there are multiple people in a vehicle, whether it's a heavy vehicle. We really want to have vehicles sort of right-sized for the use that they're being made for. So we don't need a pickup truck for every trip to the drugstore.
Yeah, I'll say that. I think I heard this in an interview a while back, which is from an anthropological perspective. Like, I think that civilization in the future will look at our generation and say, why would you drive a 1-ton vehicle to pick up a gallon of milk, right? But anyways, I'll get back to the question. So I think the other thing is, as far as with pricing, that we're internalizing those costs as well. So we already have, one of the benefits of having private companies provide the services is that they are based on demand and they will have surge pricing built into them. And I think that is valuable from a perspective that if we no longer are driving our own vehicles and are taking vehicles as a service, it's a little bit more intuitive for me to say, if I'm the only person in the vehicle that's being driven, I should probably be paying more, as opposed to if I'm on a CTA train where it's literally moving 1,000 people per second past the fixed point. So I think there's a ability to actually fix some market failures that we currently have today. As somebody's going to O'Hare in the rush hour today, to understand that a variation could be 2 hours difference in that travel time. There's probably a better way to do things. So, and that's what we hope to do. So, I think I'll just end it off there.